I am Daniel Lucas, and welcome to Book 101 Review. Book 101 is all about the books that I read for the last 40 years. And today I have no special guest. He's the author of the novel or the horror novel Render, no other than Mr. Subtamad.
Hello, everyone. My name is Zub the Mad. I'm a horror author. I write horror, dark fantasy, and grimdark. It's a pleasure to be on the show. Thank you for so much for having me on the show, Daniel.
You are most welcome, Mr. Zub, and thank you so much for sharing your talents to the world.
Oh, I appreciate that. That's very nice of you.
Thank you so much. So, what defines a horror novel in literary terms?
Well, horror is a general genre. It has to do with approaching subjects that are kind of intrinsic to the human condition. I define horror as something that involves like conflicts with the unknown, conflicts with the unsettling, the disturbing. Doesn't necessarily have to involve blood and guts. It has to invoke some level of terror. So I like to parallel into Stephen King's definition of horror, which I think is very good. He says there are three tiers of horror. There's vulgarity or revulsion, which is like blood and guts, gore, that type of stuff. Then there's horror proper, which is the element of the horrific event happening within, immediately. Like the immediate danger is how you would describe horror as the tier. And then terror, which is the fear of the ooga booga booga around the corner. So it's
Yes.
the tension that rises as a result of immediate danger that is being threatened.
So, Mr. Zub,
Mhm.
how can psychological horror differ from supernatural horror in a novel?
I think psychological and supernatural can part and parcel, but they're like components of it. So psychological, as I write, is a lot more focused on the terror aspect of it, which is the mounting danger, the sense of impending dread. If you've ever a good analog would be like if you've ever played the Silent Hill series, at least the original ones before they I digress. It's a lot more focused on the atmosphere and building that tension as well as just a genuine sense of palpable dread, for a lack of a better term, that is around the corner. I am very much into that. I like building the tension. I like creating that sense of unease and just genuine feelings of unsettling uncertainty. That's kind of what I go on, but it doesn't necessarily mean that those are mutually exclusive from supernatural because ghost stories can also have psychological elements. Like maybe, I don't know, I'm just spitballing here as an example of like dovetailing between psychological and supernatural is that maybe only one person can see the ghost and everyone else thinks they're crazy. So there's like
Yes.
a conflict and tension between the person trying to tell the truth of there is a ghost in my house and everyone's like not necessarily agreeing with them. And that alone can create a sense of psychological dread, a feeling of isolation, a feeling of myself against the unknown. So I think those are qualitative elements that can be within and coexist within the same book or medium.
So, do you believe in ghosts, Mr. Zub?
Uh, I would say I'm skeptical,
Yes.
but okay. So I define myself as an agnostic atheist. So and I think we're gonna double tail, but I'll meander off this little tangent into answering your question. So if you and the audience could bear with me for a second as I kind of um tape record tape play my thoughts. Man, I'm carbon dating myself with that reference.
Yes.
Um so agnosticism is a statement that you're not entirely sure. You're uncertain as to the answer to the ultimate question is if there is supernaturality if there is a divine being in whatever form. So atheism is the claim of I don't know slash I don't believe you when you make the claim of a divine being or divine presence. However, agnosticism quantifies it by saying that I'm not sure, but I'm inclined to not believe in it. But if evidence is given to the contrary, I'm willing to change my opinion. Hopefully that answers your question.
So, Mr. Su, what is the premise of Render?
So, Render is a story about a college student that, through a ego-driven means of self-destruction, ends up ultimately getting kicked out of college. And as a result, the setup is that he is very uneasy about the path of his life. He's not sure what's going to happen next. He's spent a lot of time and a lot of energy pursuing his computer science degree, ultimately to have his thesis bombed by the people that were supervising to give him the doctorate. And as a result, he recollects himself and the pieces of his life by going back to his small town, which is one of those towns. Have you ever been to a town that is so small that it doesn't register correctly on a GPS?
Not yet.
Yeah. So like we're talking like bad cell phone service. We're talking like maybe one computer in the entire area might have network access, but it's probably like dial up. It
Modem.
yeah. Yeah, it's in the middle of like who knows nowhere. And he goes back to his home to reconnect and have that awkward conversation with his living parent, who is his kind of overbearing mother. And he brings along his friend who might be a little interested in him, but he's Charles is a Charles is spectrum coded. Being on the spectrum myself, I thought it would be kind of interesting to have someone that's a little bit ambivalent slash uncertain as to how to interact with people, but is like very, very good at the thing that he's trying to do. Um, and sometimes there's like conflict between himself and society as a result. Without getting too far into the weeds, a lot of weird stuff happens. It begins with the town being slowly absorbed by a sinkhole. At least that's what they think it is. And it is the exploration of that impending cataclysm in conjunction with Charles trying to put together the pieces of his life. I won't get any further on that because, got to leave the audience wanting more.
Yes. So, Mr. Sub, what are the key characteristics of a horror novel's atmosphere like Render?
So I alluded to it kind of before with the Stephen King's hierarchy of terror, hierarchy of horror, I believe he calls it, um, where you have to build a tension-filled atmosphere. You have to build that sense of unease, just general discomfort when it comes to being put into an uncertain situation, and also like kind of what's the word I'm looking for? Um, Set up the threat in a credible way that is kind of it's unavoidable. You'll eventually have to deal with the big problem, but it's in a way that it's seems almost overwhelming, and that alone creates and elevates the horror that comes with it. So I think the most important thing to a horror novel or any horror medium in general is that feeling of helplessness and a feeling of being locked in with the big bad thing that you don't want to deal with. Um, and a lot of the elements of my book, as they pieces come together, create that environment of inescapability and inevitability. I think that's part and parcel what drives me to the genre is that feeling of confronting the great unknown, the great unavoidable unknown. Because there are, I'm kind of yapping right now, but there's a lot of very unavoidable elements in our lives, like right, not to bring down the mood, but like we're all gonna eventually not be here anymore. That's a real existential terror is what happens after it's all said and done, after the metaphorical band stops playing on the chapter of our lives and that book that is our lives closes. That's an unavoidable, ambivalent unknown that creates a lot of apprehension in people. Um, so I'm using that real life analog, not to make everyone suddenly be like, "Oh God, I'm mortal." Um, but but that element of it is very universal, and I think being able to play into that universality of that unknown that is uncomfortable that we don't really want to talk about is what makes a good horror anything good, is because it's a and it's going to sound weird, but it's kind of a therapeutic way to confront those big unknowns that we have that are just intrinsic in life, right?
Yes. So how does suspense build tension in a horror novel like Render?
Yeah, so I can only speak for how I do my methods because everyone's methods are going to be a little bit different. But in the book, the concept of othering, um, the concept of the outsider being looked upon as a means of suspicion and apprehension plays into Render a lot. Charles's friend Serena is looked upon as an outsider, not necessarily welcome in the town. Like it starts as a why are you here? Like who comes here aside from people that live here?
Yes.
And it kind of develops from there. Um and I think a lot of the suspense and is created through that sense of tension that is pretty um ubiquitous. I'm not trying to throw out big words, but that's pretty ubiquitous to our lives, right? Have you ever been in a place where like you're like, why am I here? I don't feel comfortable.
Yes.
Um yeah. So that level of tension builds into suspense because if you're in like a, I don't know, like a sketchy area, making it kind of generic. If you're in a sketchy area that you know you're not supposed to be here, you took one wrong turn and you're now like in an area where you're seeing like a lot of signs that maybe you should have taken the other turn. There's an element of suspense there because there's uncertainty. There's an uncertain dread that fills you because that's your fight or flight instincts kicking in, right? That's like
Yes.
you going, I don't want to be here. And I think good suspense builds that level of apprehension. And also without necessarily ratifying that feeling of instinctual apprehension and tension that you feel, um, it suspense would create and kind of slowly, insidiously, kind of um, not necessarily say you're valid for feeling that way, but maybe there's something there. Maybe there is a reason why you feel this way. And I think suspense, when done properly, creates that ambiguity as to whether or not you're valid in having that concern.
So, Mr. Soup, did you experience already this valid experiences that there's a really a ghost out there?
Oh, yeah. I mean, I was born in an inner city, without divulging too much, and there were definitely certain areas of the neighborhood that you did not go. And there were times where while I was a young my gimmick is I'm crocodilian. I'm wearing a human suit right now. It's a whole thing. Don't worry about it. When I was a youth, uh, traveling around that area, a young crocodile, as I like to riff on, I ended up in some places where I shouldn't have been, and maybe some people that I shouldn't have interacted with asked me where I was from. Which, if you know, you know. So
Hmm, yes, for sure. So, what role does fear play in shaping horror stories' narrative?
I think it's inherent. Like horror is the genre of fear. Horror when done properly, is the exploration of fear, a very universal emotion that, I mean, everyone has, right? Um, Everyone's going to be afraid at some point in life. And I think it's very important for the horror genre to explore that and to create, like, and I've kind of alluded to this before in our previous questions, but almost a therapeutic environment to healthily explore that idea of what that is, how that feels like, and how to navigate that. So I'd say horror without fear is just bad writing.
Mm, definitely. So, Mr. Sub, what will be your advice for those aspiring writers out there want to write a horror novel?
Do it. That's the first thing. And it sounds like so obvious, but I think sometimes we need to be reminded of the obvious. You can't write a book without writing a book. You
Yes.
can't start with that. You can't finish something without actually starting it. And one of my favorite bits of writing advice I've ever received was you can always, the best part of a written page is that you can always edit it later. The worst part of a blank page is that there's nothing to edit. So,
Yes.
so I would recommend that anyone in any genre, really, that wants to start should, and they should come to it with an area of exploration and an area of forgiveness, because you're not going to write like Ernest Hemingway, or he even he didn't like his work actually. He was actually pretty famous with saying, "I think I'm a bad writer, but I do it anyways because I have to." I'm grossly paraphrasing it, but yeah, he had a lot of imposter syndrome. Bukowski also kind of thought of that too. So like, think about it. The main writers that are like very prominent across the world, they have imposter syndrome. I mean, you should just start. Do it anyways. Forgive yourself. Acknowledge that you're not going to write the great American novel the first time, that you're probably going to write some stuff that's not good, and that's okay. It's about the
Yes.
journey. It's about self-exploration. It's about developing your skills and just doing it.
Just do it, people, and stop procrastinating. If you have the passion to write, and share to the world. We are just only visitor on earth and just leave mark to our generations, to generations to come. So what is your short-term and long-term goals in writing, Mr. Zub?
Well, so my journey is a little bit different than a lot of other people. I like to come from it from a, I call it confessional writing. Um so my inspiration, my reason for being a writer is because I have I have a chronic and unavoidable nightmares. That's just part of how my brain works, and it's one of those things where I never know when I'm going to have a bad night. And I found throughout the course of my life that writing not only my nightmares down, but just writing horror in general and seeking that content is actually a form of therapy for me. It helps me realize that I'm not alone, that I'm able to voice these things, that I'm able to quantify and qualify these things that are just part of my life and probably will always be a part of my life. Um, so my short-term goals are just to keep doing it because it's helping. It helps me feel better. It helps me become I want to say it helps me become more normal, but like I don't think normal is a thing. I think normal is just a word that we give ourselves as a means of just being complicit within our societies. I think what I'm really looking for short term wise is just to write as I write and just keep doing it. I guess a more less abstract short term goal is I have a second book coming out. It's a grim dark fantasy horror thing from the Iron Age. I want to get that book done by the end of next year. So that would be a short term goal, like an actual like pragmatic short term goal. As for long term goals, I have a lot of notes from what I like to affectionately call my nightmare journal that needs to see a page at some point in time. So I have at least like 30 different nightmares that I thought were pretty good, interesting, looking at it from a 1,000-foot view rather than, directly experiencing it in my dreams. And I guess my long-term goal would be to put them on paper in some way. I have a few of them, like I write short stories as well, but there are a couple that are bouncing around in my head. There was one that is pretty recurring since the time I was 12 that I really want to see hit a paperback page at some point. I did originally a first draft of the manuscript, and I'm like, I need to get this done. I need to do this better. So again, talking about the last question of like forgiving yourself, and the best part of a filled page is that you can edit it later. That is a direct correlation. So that would be one of my long-term goals. I think that one is going to be my. It's so cheesy to call it a magnum opus, but like it's the albatross, right?
Yes.
So that's part of my long-term goal is I want to get A Maze of Spines done properly. I wanted to get it the attention and the sounds so highfalutin when I say gravitas, but the impact that it affected me with onto the page and give it the gravitas that it deserves. Because it's such a main bugbear that's been bouncing around in my skull for the longest.
Good luck to your goals, Mr. Sub, and you are most welcome to come back to promote your second horror novel. And to sum up our episode for today, how might a fragmented or non-linear narrative support the horror genre themes?
I can think of a couple of good books. Have you ever read House of Leaves?
No, not yet.
You should. That's a really good answer your question. That's a pretty direct answer your question. Um, if you ever look into the ergodic literature subgenre, that's a really good one. What was that other book? I think it's called Burn This Book, but don't quote me on that, which is a series of nonlinear horror short stories that take place in a post-apocalyptic world where apparently like toxins fall from the sky, and that's kind of like the recurring underlying theme that dovetails everything together. I feel like that title that I just spit is wrong for it, but that's the only one I can think of that I'm gonna have to look that up after we talk to make sure that I got the right thing. But that's a good one. Anything ergodic really is a great answer to your question. There's a whole subgenre of like nonlinear storytelling slash are you familiar with the term ARG?
No, not yet. What is it
Uh
all about?
Augmented reality games. So
Oh,
I think there's a few like the most common most mainstream reference to this is like Cicada
mm,
3301. Um, it falls under a certain subgenre called unfiction, which is reality-based nonlinear storytelling that is interactive in nature. Like it's a lot of like puzzles and stuff like that hidden within like thumbnails of YouTube videos and other medium. Welcome Home is another great example of like just a website that um talks about like 1970s Sesame Street like store tale that apparently went weird and strange and goes into like horror territory, and it's all about like discovering like little bits and bobs of the website that are hidden from regular view and that investigative storytelling. um so nonlinearity is a pretty is something that exists within a lot of ergodic literature. Um, so I would recommend House of Leaves because it's the most mainstream one. I wouldn't say it's the most accessible thing. You're gonna have to definitely put some time, effort, and energy to get through that book because it is a labyrinth and constructed as such. Um, it's the story of a disenfranchised man who buys a house as part of an investigative exploration of some weird thing, weird series of tapes, and it turns into this whole like crazy, bizarre, surreal nightmare. And it's very much like you're bouncing from the present to like somewhere in the 1970s. There's this whole like back and forth and how it relates, and then you start slowly connecting the pieces together, but it does demand that level of attention from you. So like it's definitely not like sip your tea, put on a YouTube video and like read a book passively. This is an active storytelling experience. But yeah.
Mr. Subdemad, again, thank you so much for sharing your horror novels or horror novel to the world. Render, can you please invite our listeners to support Render?
Yeah, for sure. Thank you so much for having me.
Yes, so where they can buy your book, mister?
Oh, I have my own website, xubthemad.com. I haven't made a little jingle. I also stream on Twitch under the same name. I have a podcast, thebrokenlords.com, which is a D&D style actual play podcast where we take a bunch of independent horror themed tabletop games and we play through them. So yeah, I also voice act too. But, I mean, that's
Yes.
not
Yes, people, let's support Zoob the Mad, because if you support him, more horror novels to come. And of course, the podcast itself, more episodes to come. So, Mr. Zoob, thank you for your time.
Thank you, Daniel. Thank you for having me.
More to come, people. See you soon.
Bye, all.
You are most welcome to come back next year, Mr. Zoob, to promote your second